So we continue with our analysis. We are here at the Results Operations Center in Midrand. We're at the big desk, and we've had plenty of expert panelists, in fact, joining us for extra analysis and bring you the latest to help make sense of that numbers that will be trickling in as soon as the processing gets underway. So we're going to continue with our conversations now. In fact, for more on this, are going to be joined by more analysis. Dr. Imraan Buccus is one of our political analysts. He's going to be joining us at this hour to unpack how the day's progressed and really what we're anticipating at this point. Dr. Imraan, good evening, and thank you for joining us on the SABC once again.
Thanks for having me.
Right, so we were chatting offline. We're trying to understand the pivotal moment that is before South Africa. I mean, all eyes on South Africa at this point. It's been dubbed a watershed moment, landmark elections. Talk to us about the voter turnout that we are seeing this time round compared to 2019, compared to 2014. Why so? What's at stake?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, right?
Yeah.
Why more people are turning up to vote now?
Yeah.
So certainly a pivotal election. I think there are some key questions that people are asking. What makes 30 years a really important moment in the life of a democracy? I think 30 years is the mark at which liberation movements tend to get pushed to the periphery. Questions are being asked about, has the ANC lost its liberationist core? And when you have those sorts of questions, and when you hear people in long lines saying today, especially young people, that we're tired, that we want change, I think what they're also saying to us is that, all of this romance of the liberation that we go on about has certainly made them tired, because they remain unemployed, they remain on the margins of society. So that's the one point. But it's also led to what I would call, at the 30-year mark, a critical realignment in our politics. We're seeing what we call the MPC, the multi-party coalition, right? So not only the DA, but also the IFP. Now, who would have thought that you'd put the DA and the IFP in the same basket? The DA, I would contend, is liberal, and the IFP conservatives for so many reasons. And yes, you have the Action SA in between. But it's a political intervention that kind of addresses the crisis that we have at the 30-year mark.
Yes.
And then, of course, you have MK, Makashule's outfit, the EFF, for want of a better description, the former RET forces. So there is that realignment. So South Africa is not one country. Of course, there are many people in the lines today saying, well, we want to see the end of the ANC because we want to change. At the same time, we have many people in the line today who are saying, well, I think the ANC has made huge mistakes. Corruption, maldistribution, infighting, which is very much what happens to liberation movements, not just in South Africa, but across the world, especially in the global south. But people are saying, has the ANC reached a moment of moral regeneration, if you like? And I'd like to spend a moment, if you'll allow me,
Absolutely.
to talk about that a bit. So are we justified in thinking the ANC has let us down? In many ways, I'd say yes, we are, right? Because they have. We've seen unemployment, people cut off from water and electricity, sanitation, etc., etc. But I'd also contend this is a moment of moral regeneration. And for the first time, I think a foreign policy issue of what's happening in Israel and Palestine is impacting many South Africans. On a day that we go to the polls, there's an unrelenting strike in Gaza, or strikes in Gaza. And I think people are really moved by that. And there have been many moments in ANC history where it's had this moral high ground.
I wonder if we could focus on, whether this time around it's an ideological race, or is it more been about identity politics? Talk us through that spectrum that's come to the fore, and then continue your point of the moral rejuvenation that you'd spoken about. Yeah, this sounds like a thesis. Where do we begin? Balance it for us.
Yeah, there's so many points there, right? So maybe let's pick up on what he said firstly.
Sure.
He asked the question more or less, is there anyone for us? And I think the critical question he really is posing and, pointing to us is that our democracy is in tatters, right? It's ravaged by the cruelty of poverty, it's ravaged by the cruelty of unemployment and inequality. I mean, you just go to Santon and you look across and you see Alex. You know, that kind of vulgarity of capital that we see in this country. And here this young man is pleading, on the day of the elections, is there anyone for us? So I think quite clearly, you know, the question about whether the ANC has lost its liberationist core is understandable, right? But I also said I think people are still looking to the ANC. And in part I said it's because maybe the ANC is at a point of moral rejuvenation. And it's not just now, it's been through this point several times. I would suggest, you know, if we want to go back in history, 1912 may have been the one point where African nationalism, stood up against the Union in 1910, the coming together of white South Africa, Afrikaner and English. In the 60s, the armed struggle, you know, inspired many people because the ANC was saying, we will take no more and we will fight you back. In 69, Morogoro, in 85, Kabwe. These were pivotal moments in ANC history. And now when we witness a genocide against a people asking for self-determination, and the world by and large stands silent, and the ANC, you know, stands up, or the South African government stands up, I think that marks a point of moral rejuvenation. Does that intervention in Israel and Palestine resonate with all South Africans? No, maybe not. But it certainly does with many progressive South Africans. What the young man was asking about, who is there for us? We just saw the DA release a kind of economic policy document a few days ago, a sort of 52-page document. And in the document, you know, many of the things they say are completely neoliberal. They talk about reducing import tariffs. Reducing import tariffs has a huge impact on South African manufacturing sector. We know what happened in the late 90s to the leather and textile industries in the Western Cape, in KZN. You know, poor people who worked in the leather and textile industries were decimated. Many women who worked in clothing factories lost their jobs. What's the significance of that point? It's significant because it's a particular type of economic policy that the DA now still articulates. The DA talks also about capping minimum wage or restricting minimum wage, and it talks about a range of other things that are really market friendly. And whereas the question the young man asks is perhaps better answered by ANC policy that looks at state intervention. So ultimately it's a complex case. There are varying forces. We're not one country. We're several countries, or perhaps two countries if you like. One country of middle-class privileged South Africans who probably want to see the country go in a direction as articulated by the DA. And then we have masses who rely on social grants, who rely on social welfare. 30% of South Africans have some kind of social welfare, you know, child support or old age pensions or whatever it is. And they would maybe think that a party like the ANC in power is more likely to guarantee that than maybe the multi-party coalition. So we in many ways at a crossroads.
Absolutely about being at the crossroads. We're also looking at possibilities and probabilities as well. I was actually reading a book by Oyama Mabandla, Soul of the Nation, speaking about how South Africa's problems at this point might be too big for one party to handle. And so how do we all come together, parties, independent candidates, civil society, business at large, to charter that way forward? And I think that is definitely going to be part of the conversation. But on the issue of the political spectrum, looking at the opposition, the fragmentation of the opposition at large as well, the impact that that would have had on voter choice, as well as, what's on offer. How do you think those dynamics played out for South Africans having to look at those three ballots, that long list continued?
Yeah, well, the long list and the ballot, I think that's an important point, right?
Yes.
We can talk about the IEC later on, but I think, can you imagine a poorly educated woman in the rural area going to these three ballots looking for a picture, and not being able to find the picture? How does she vote? And then we ask questions about why there's still long lines and why are we not complete with the process. And I think the IEC was aware told by the Electoral Institute and others that the 3 ballots is going to impact on the voting time. So yes, but I think fundamentally you have the big 3, the ANC, the DA and the EFF, but like we know, the MK has been a huge game changer, right? And one doesn't really know what the MK offers in policy terms, but we do know that this has a disenfranchised faction of the ANC that was pushed to the political margins, perhaps largely when Premier Sihle Zikalala was pushed out of power in KZN. And this faction was operating on the fringes, on the political fringes in KZN. The ascendancy of Zuma gives political hope to this ANC faction. So the point is there's a very close relationship between that ANC and the MK, and I don't, and I could be completely wrong, I don't anticipate MK getting as much as 30% in KZN, but I do think they will be a significant force. And I think MK changes the game, particularly in KZN.
Some have said that the MK party has displayed politics 101 in action, just given that they're just the disruptive mode that they've entered these elections in. So mixed opinions obviously at this point. Perhaps as we look at South Africa, the state, you spoke about some of the new players, introduction of independent candidates as well. What do you think that's done for this race? Perhaps also for choice in democracy, which is what democracy is all about.
Well, the independent candidates, I'm not surprised that we see, hardly any candidates at the national level and very few at the provincial level. I think in large part it's really hard for an independent candidate to make it, especially at the national level. I would think virtually impossible. Yes, of course, someone like Zaki Ahmed that has the kind of brand equity that he has, it perhaps more likely that he would stand a better chance than others. But I think the bigger point, Liesl, is the idea of, to what extent was the South African electorate educated about this change? And I would say very little was done. To what extent did the IEC and political parties engage in campaigns to really educate people about what do 3 ballots mean? How does the regional to national work, etc.? And which brings me to another point. I think in many African countries, they've recurriculated. And part of the educational recurriculating has really meant that civic education, voter education has, come into their education system. And I think we need to think very seriously about that. We need to be educating young people about not only electoral politics, but I think participatory democracy more broadly. And certainly my concern is that people were left with very little education about the changes to the Electoral Act. And clearly today we've seen lots of problems. Part of it might be, some say, juniorization of the IEC. They could have anticipated longer queues. They could have anticipated that this will have a huge turnout. But I don't think the IEC is incompetent. I think the IEC is the kind of central pivot amongst our Chapter 9 institutions. But when you cut the budget of the IEC by some 350 million, and when the IEC is going to expect even more cuts, and when the electoral changes are only finalized late last year, you have a 3-ballot system, you have a lack of education, you have court cases that some may say were unnecessary coming to the fore. Of course, you would expect the kinds and types of problems we've seen today.
It's going to be interesting to also see the caucusing that's now going to be happening from here on too. And I know that is another ball game on its own as the clock ticks on. Let's park that conversation there for now. Thank you very much for that analysis. The conversation, of course, continues. We're here at the Results Operations Center. Dr. Imraan Buccus joining us, political analyst, joining us at this hour. Really just making sense of some of the possibilities and probabilities. This is voting has concluded at some of the voting stations, and really what we can anticipate from here on too.